Hello, everybody. Wait, how do I do it? I think I saved my name first. I don't know why I'm having a brain fart. Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with the One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I'm joined today, and I'm joined, as always and forever, by my good friend, my business partner, the whiskey wizard, the man who's looking more and more like Dumbledore mixed with Fidel Castro every day. Jason Johnston Yellen.
Yeah. Hey, let's open here. Just quickly, letting all of our listeners know that a very dear friend passed recently. And as you're talking about the Whiskey Wizard and the Dumbledore and the Fidel Castro, this was a man whose style I am clearly looking to replicate. And so the wonderful, wonderful Harvey Fry, famously out of Washington, D.C., famously associated with Jack Rose Dining Saloon, unfortunately passed recently at the age of 82.
Yeah.
And he was a great guy for visiting in D.C. He came through, spent time with us in New York as well.
At the Jubilee,
We had a wonderful time with him at St. Andrews after an evening one time.
I remember that. And his poem.
He was I remember him reciting that at you right across the table. And when I say reciting, he barked it at you from memory across a table at St. Andrews. That was a wonderful, wonderful moment. But I would go through to DC. I would see him at Jack Rose. I would pour him single cask nation stuff. And he would always be unflinchingly honest with what was being poured. There was never a sense of him playing favorites. There was never a sense of people in an inner circle got it easier than those outside the circle.
That's true.
And I always enjoyed that. Always enjoyed it. And it was wonderful as we started to make our mark in the industry. I would get phone calls and voicemails from Harvey.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to try and replicate his voice, but it was gravel being passed through the engine of a Harley Davidson motorcycle while you were pouring single malt, single cask strength whiskey into your ears. It was that type of voice. And I don't know if I even got close to an approximation of his voice.
I remember.
But when he's...
Oh, go ahead.
But when he started calling me up for 6-packs of our stuff, or saw some scores coming in from Serge Valentin at Whiskey Fun, and would then call up and say, I need 6 of those, that was a wonderful, wonderful moment. So unfortunately, Roberto and Bill and Harvey and Jared Card and myself had been trying to schedule a whiskey get-together in DC. COVID hit. It's been over a year. None of us scheduled it. We all wanted Harvey to hole up in his house. Ultimately, it wasn't COVID that got him, but we protected him through all of COVID and we didn't expose him to unnecessary risks. And I'm really bummed that I never got that final tasting with him. Wonderful wealth of knowledge. But what were you going to say, Joshua?
It was one of these times when Serge Serge at Whiskey Fun reviewed one of our whiskeys, and I think it was our Laphroaig 5. We got 92 points on that. And somehow, some way, because you were closer with Harvey than I was, but somehow, some way, he had gotten my phone number. I don't know if you gave it to him or Jared gave it to him, but he called me up just excited, and like you had said, it's like he's talking through gravel and cobblestone, just and he was just so excited that Serge gave you 92 points. You got 92 points on a 5-year-old Laphroaig, and he was so excited for us, right? Because like you had said early on, he he would always give us his honest opinion, and we'd always look to him for that. And Serge is obviously someone that he respected a great deal, and I think he was excited for us that Serge had given us that type of score for that Laphroaig. I'll never forget that call.
Yeah, I think the fact that we came out with an Arran finished in Pinot, that's not a Harvey Fry whiskey.
No.
We had a Kilchoman 4-year-old where he saw the potential for the distillery, but it was still such early doors that it wasn't really resonating. And then we had a Benriach, a peated Benriach 17, which was Highland peat. And it really took having an established Islay distillery at a younger age to pull that off. I think really caught Harvey's eye. He was also a huge Laphroaig guy and would tell me repeatedly to my face in DC at Jack Rose that it was the older, like mid-teen, sherried Laphroaigs that the Scotch Malt Whisky Society were putting out. Those were the good Laphroaigs. Those were the good single casks. And so there were moments when, you know, we would get Harvey's attention, but and it's so funny because I did think of him with a special project that we're working on that's an older sherried Laphroaig, and I'm going to be gutted that he doesn't have a chance to taste that one and give us an opinion on that one. Gosh, the fact that bottling is now associated with two dear friends who have passed on to the other side.
Yeah.
Jeez Louise.
Wow.
I feel a gut punch happening live while we're recording this.
Speaking of gut punches, I wasn't with you to interview our guest for today.
You weren't. You weren't.
Yeah. I felt
we
as
made
if
the best of it.
You did? I mean,
Had you been punched in the gut?
Well, I felt as if I had been punched in the gut by something. There was no way on earth I would have been able to just sit for a recording. I did, you know, I'm very cognizant people don't like, you know, TMI, too much information, so I'm not going to put it out there. But the amount of explosive diarrhea I dealt with that day was just stunning. So I'm glad that you took the helm and you interviewed Nick without me.
I did tell Nick that Joshua sends his apologies, but his stomach is turning cartwheels and casting out contents both north and south. And I felt like that downplayed it enough. Yeah. I felt like that wasn't giving away too much.
No, I think that nailed it. That nailed it.
Feeling better now?
I feel so much better now. Oh my gosh, that was a day, Jason. That was a few days, actually.
So this is interesting. Nick brought this up, that a pattern has developed,
right,
where a number of different meetings have been set up that involve the team at Single Cask Nation and the team at Holyrood, and Joshua hasn't made it to any of them. And it's starting to look like avoidance.
Can I be honest with you, Jason?
I think you only ever are. If your explosive diarrhea comment is anything to go on.
The fact of the matter is, Nick Ravenhall, a.k.a. Ravenclaw, is...
I'm giving you a Dumbledore round of applause here.
He is so drop-dead sexy that I feel inadequate in his presence. And the dude barely wears clothes. If you go on Instagram, you'll see him. He's wearing a Speedo at best. And I just, you know, I feel less than.
It's funny you should bring up the Speedo because we didn't get into it in the interview. There just wasn't time.
You couldn't get into a Speedo. Okay, I get it.
Well, we had a brilliant chat. But he's swum the Corrie Vrecken with whiskey crammed in his Speedo. I thought he was just pleased to see me, but it turns out it was whiskey crammed in said Speedo. And so just very briefly over email, he and I had a little chat where I was telling him about the Great Isle of Swim. And obviously those chaps starting their swim by doing a pagan ritual in the Corrie Vrecken with the bear fat. But the fact that Nick himself is a bit of an adventurer, getting out there, doing things, exploring the world, really speaks to a chap with a like mind. Not that you and I are going out and doing any of that stuff, but that we know people who do.
Yeah. We've been in spitting distance of people who do.
Yeah. Need sponsorship? Let's talk. Need someone to sign a check? We might be your guys. But I love that. I love that Corrie Vrecken connection with our chaps and the expedition, and then Nick doing his little bit. So, I know we'll speak again, both over drams, and we've talked about breaking bread now for, a couple of years, and that still hasn't happened.
Yeah,
But I think he'll be back on the pod as well. I wouldn't be surprised to see that.
And Nick, if you're listening, hoping you're listening, it is nothing personal. Shit literally happened. And but we will see one another, and we will share drams and bread and hugs, and there you go.
Yeah. So just to very quickly set the scene for our dear listeners, Nick is currently in New Zealand. I continue to be in Virginia, and we actually did a Google Hangout with him at his parents' house off in New Zealand. He will tell you the name of the town. I'm not going to attempt it at this moment because it'll just be embarrassing for me. but Nick will give the name of the town in the interview. But as we've been doing all the way through COVID, he recorded locally to his machine. I recorded locally to my machine. There were moments, the Google Hangout wasn't particularly well behaved. And so there were moments when he and I were doing our best to kind of fill in the gaps in a dropped sentence or in a dropped question or in a dropped response. So if the listener encounters any weird moments where the two of us seem to be on a different page from one another, know that we were filling in buffering gaps. However, the quality of the audio is not going to demonstrate that. So I just wanted people to know that we had a brilliant time talking to each other. And we probably spoke an hour and a half, an hour and 3/4, and you'll tidy this up or you will have tidied this up in post, and it'll be a hair tidier than the actual raw audio. But yeah, Nick and I, and I can say this because you're never there being a third or fourth wheel, but Nick and I just thoroughly enjoy one another's company. And, he's such an easy chap to talk to. His journey is fascinating. And we spend a good portion of the intro talking about that spark. Where did this begin? Where did this go? Then we go into talking about Holyrood. Then I've got some general questions for him. Independent bottling, the New Zealand scene. One of the things I was saying to him is our listenership in Australia and New Zealand is growing in leaps and bounds. And one of the questions we took in our, the mailbag portion of the Bill Lumsden episode that kicked off season 5 was about the rise of Australian and New Zealand distilling. And Nick addresses that in a later part of the interview as well. So yeah, we covered the gamut, just like Bill Lumsden. There's a whole bunch of stuff we didn't even bring up that we could bring up in a future chat. But any last questions for me, Joshua, before we throw it over to the chat?
Of the hour and 37 minutes, because that's the actual time signature, by the way, hour and 37 minutes. Because I haven't.
We were talking both before and after we hit record.
Well, the recorded portion was an hour and 37, and I haven't listened back to the audio yet, but that's my plan this evening. Of those minutes and that hour, how much time was spent on Hobbiton? Go.
I did bring it up that's a thing that you've got eyes on. I would say a good 8 or 10 seconds were spent on Hobbiton.
Yeah, okay. I appreciate you just bringing it up, right? I just threw me a little bone, the smallest bone imaginable, but...
Yeah, it was more along the lines of, I'm going to spend months and months on whiskey things, and Joshua's going to go to Hobbiton, and then see what happens after that.
All right. Let's hand it over to your conversation with the good Nick Ravenhall.
Hold on tight, here I come. Thanks for making time. Appreciate it. Always good to see you. For the benefits of our listeners and to help them get a handle on who Nick Ravenhall is, let's jump in the Wayback Machine. How did it start? What was your spark, especially for us in the Northern Hemisphere? We're not overly familiar with how the spark comes to be in the Southern Hemisphere. So how did that come about? How old were you? Where were you? What were the circumstances?
You know, there used to be a
Getting
bit...
to know you.
There used to be a bit... I was thinking about this the other day. We're going in the old time machine. Didn't feel like that much of a journey back in the past. And then I started to realise I'm starting to run out of whiskies that I can drink that I can afford, and I'm actually younger than. I'm like, oh, no, that thing's really clicking over. Look, I'm thrilled to be here and have this wee chat. And I was thinking about this morning because I thought this might come out like, Nick, how did your whiskey journey start? And it's all a bit ridiculous when I think about it. I mean, my first kind of interaction with whiskey was, I'm going to go way back to '94 when Snoop Dogg had his hit Gin and Juice. And, I'd been invited to my first kind of beach party. I live out at a place called a Pottery, which is on the coast of New Zealand. And, I'd been invited to my first beach party. I was 14 years old, and I'd gone to my old man, trying to be like the good son, and said, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to a party. Can I have some booze?" And he looked at me and squared me up. And he's a builder, right? So there's a little bit like, I hope I get approved. And he went, "Yeah." And I was like, "Oh my God, I've got the coolest dad in the world." And then he gave me 2 cans of light beer, and that was it. And I even then I thought, oh, fuck me, I can't go to a party armed like this. So
how old were you again?
14. And so with
I thought you said 14. Okay.
And with Snoop Dogg's refrain in my head, sipping on gin and juice, I've gone to their liquor cabinet when they're not looking, and I've gone, okay, what am I going to nick? And I went for Johnny Red, and I went, I don't know what this tastes like. I tried it neat, and I was like, I'm not touching this shit ever again. But then went down the rabbit hole with gin, and half a litre of gin topped up with water, then orange juice, and that was. I mean, this is a story for another time. It was a big night, but I was right off whiskey after that. I wouldn't go near it, and that's the same for a lot of us down here, because down under back then, your first whiskey experience was usually Jim Beam and Coke in a white can. And if you're a flash, you could afford Jack Daniels or Johnny Red, but that was it. So I didn't really pay that much attention to it until I started bartending. And, I started bartending. Okay. Yeah. So I started bartending as soon as I could. And, I was familiar with Drambuie, and at the end of a work shift, you could pour yourself a shot or something. And I was like, I didn't want to look like a Muppet. So I was like, Drambuie, that's mine, on my first shift. And everyone was like, whoa, that's really hardcore. And I was like, yeah, really hardcore. And then that was it. Like, I mean, it's just, that's why I said the story is ridiculous. And And then I used to make rusty nails. That would be my kind of signature closing drink. And, you know, if someone was asking me for a beverage or recommend something, these poor bastards were getting really badly made rusty nails back in 2002, 2001. And then
so what's in a rusty nail? It's not one that I've got easy recall on. Rusty nail. Drambuie and something.
It's just it's equal parts Drambuie and blended Scotch, and you know away you go. So this kind of carried on as my manly thing as I went from bar to bar to bar, and you know people new bar crews were like, oh man, wow, look at you drinking that rusty nail, and then I ended up working at a bar called Whiskey, and Whiskey was New Zealand's first true whiskey bar. And this is 2002, and our founder Andrew Bruce, an owner, he had been over to LA. He was really into great rock and roll, and of course he was inspired by Whiskey A Go Go, so he brought that back. It was such a different bar for the time, because everywhere else I'd been working had been, you remember that era of cocktails re-emerging. It was cosmopolitan, it was big mojitos, lots of fruit, and he was like, right, we're doing classics, and I didn't know what a fucking classic cocktail was. And I tried to.
I thought Rusty Nail was classic.
Well, I mean, my go-to thriller move was an apple martini, and I tried to make one of those on the bar, and I was told, look, if you make that here again, you're not got a job. And I was only a kid, and we didn't, like, I think about this. We didn't have internet. The only kind of resource we had for bar education was Australia Bartender magazine, which we would just rifle through those copies again and again and again. You didn't have advocacy outreach programs. There's no such thing as brand ambassadors, really. That was just kind of starting, and so you really relied on what you learnt from old New Zealand Women's Weekly cocktail books, what you could find at the local library, or what the people around you could teach you. And at Whiskey, we had a crew of guys, it was all blokes, who were between the ages of maybe 26, 28. I thought they were ancient because I was just little. And they'd all been to London and covered in tattoos. And, they just came back with a bit of knowledge. And, instead of being allowed to make my rusty nail at close, we had educational sessions. And, I mean, even now when I reflect, it was pretty simple stuff. We were looking at the classic malts from Diageo and drinking our way through them. And, we had this hilarious situation where we couldn't get anyone to drink Highland Park, because Highland Park in Auckland was like this, it wasn't a bad suburb, but it was just a weird suburb out in East Auckland. So people were like, why would I drink that? And you're like, and I'd be like, I don't know why we've got that on the shelf. So that's kind of what it was like. It's kind of what it was like back then. We're not that connected, especially in New Zealand. Back then, we weren't that connected to the world in terms of the flow of information, and we really, in terms of whiskey influence, it's booming over here at the moment. There's so much interest for it, but back then it was really just, it wasn't even a thing. It wasn't anything that, unless you were a hardcore geek, it just wasn't, didn't cross your world. And if it did, it might be Johnny Walker Black, and that's about it.
Well, I'm always curious in meeting people, and obviously you and I we've only hung out online a few times, but I've always enjoyed the conversations. But where did you find your palate going? As you were doing these cocktails, as you were getting deeper into that scene, what were flavors that you were chasing? And then did you find that influencing your single malt life?
It kind of went the other way, I think, for me, making drinks. So there was a bit where I kind of, with the influence of the team that I was working with, I started to understand that the cocktails that I liked making places before were just kiddie drinks. They just taste like sugar and fruit, and they didn't speak that much to the spirit. And then I think, like a lot of people who fall into like instant whiskey passion, I was immediately at Isla. The first time I tried Lagavulin and Lafroig, I was just like, what is this? And there were references to like the food we eat out here, like smoked fish is definitely a thing. We smoke our meats, but in the liquid world, it was just like so. It was a bit of a paradigm shift. It was like, whoa, what just happened to my world? And I started to seek in my drink making to try and bring that depth and layering of flavors into my drink. So, unless someone ordered, a vodka cocktail, I wasn't making them anymore. And I went straight to old fashions, was desperately seeking rye all over the place. And on the whiskey front, there was this bit where I was, you make these weird rules up. I was like, you can only have your scotch you can only have your whiskey with 2 ice cubes. And then after that, I was like, no, just no ice cubes. That was like, add some water. Don't worry about that. Like, you just, this thing. But, that's what happened. And it's still, whiskey cocktails is still something is what I'll choose to drink if I'm wanting to go and get that comforting moment of landing at a bar. Manhattan is something that is just a drink that I've just got so much love for. I'm feeling a bit of regret now. I had this phone that was with me for half my career, and I had all these photos of Manhattans from bars all over the world. I mean, I lost it, of course, but there's just something with the layer of flavor, which just be, it's a rabbit hole. We're in the rabbit hole.
It's true. So I came from, being young, discovering single malt at university, to discovering Lafroig and thinking, oh, this is it. This is the bee's bollocks, as we like to say. And taking literally 2 decades to discover cocktails. Yeah. And now seeing the value in cocktails and the flavor profiles and just really understanding single malt is single malt, cocktails are cocktails. Enjoy them both.
Absolutely.
But don't compare one to the other. Just enjoy the flavors in each one.
Yeah, they're not. They're just they're 2 things which can really shake hands really well and exchange really nice hugs with each other. And arguments that I hear about don't mix this or don't do that. It's just why say no? Like taste is exploring and it's personal. So smoky cokey is a great drink. And 15 years ago, you would have been just got a hard stare from someone if you'd asked that. But I think it's also showing how much our palate is developing in. I hesitate to say West, but I say in our kind of Anglo countries, where drink has been this very big celebratory thing, and we take it from 0 to 60 pretty fucking fast. And now there's a little bit of, actually we can still do that pretty fast, but be really flashy at the same time.
So speaking of that kind of move and speaking of cultures, what then took a Kiwi up to the Northern Hemisphere? I'm always intrigued by that part of the journey.
I think there's 2 layers, right? There's a bit where in New Zealand we have, because it wasn't straight to Scotland, it was via Australia first. And
okay.
Yeah, so I think comparing New Zealand and Australia, I making some gross generalizations here, but here in New Zealand, it feels like we have this very close connection within the country to the UK. And, I've seen it now when I've been back home and watching the news, and, I've got my partner Liv here with me, and she's from Gloucestershire, and, she's like, wow, you've got a lot of British news on your TV. And I'm like, oh, holy crap, we do. And then 90% of Kiwis leave after we finish university, and a lot we wash up in London. And then you start to think, well, actually, that's what our parents did. And they went after their grandfathers were in the Second World War, because that's where most of their went. And then the next experience beyond that was their fathers, who also went for the first one. And then you go beyond that and you're at people coming back this way. So I think they're like, just without the whiskey connection, there is this natural journey which happens of going up. And, if I think of where I'm sitting right now, if I flew 3.5 hours, that's how long I have to go to hit Australia. Whereas, if I'm sitting in London, if I flew that far, I'm in Moscow. So it's
it's very different.
Yeah, it's very different. And so there's this sense of we're always watching the outside world. We're always, we're at the whim of what happens internationally. And we have a very outward-facing country that way. So you want to go and see it anyway. Like, you don't want to just be like, a lot of New Zealanders, you'll talk to them, and part of our cultural fabric is the story of what our journeys around the world were like. And then with the whiskey lens on it, I mean, where that happened, it was when I was a bartender, I had this feeling that we were in a very immature space with what our bars were offering, and I felt, we got tons of Irish bars here. I'm like, Irish bars are great, but we're in fucking New Zealand, and there'd be like a Lone Star down the road and TGI Fridays, and my head was like, but where's our things? Where's our place to express the stuff which we stand for? So I had this like. I can't believe I'm saying this on this podcast, but I had this vision that I wanted to change the face of New Zealand hospitality when I was a kid, and I want, and I wanted it to bring to life, so that if you came down to New Zealand and you walked into one of our bars, that you got a sense of what it was like to be Kiwi, and you were and given this really welcoming hug from our culture. So I had that, and then I fell in whiskey hole, and there's a lot of stuff happening at the same time. Like our wine industry was really becoming something that New Zealanders were proud of, rather than something we didn't know about. 42 Below, the vodka brand, was making news up and down the country and overseas, and our coffee culture was growing, cafe culture was changing, and I just kept sitting and looking at whiskey bottles, going, well, why the fuck aren't we making this here? And then that just became like, it was like, right, well, when you go, you're going to go and you're going to learn how to, I had this vision that I'd be this magical distiller, right? I was like, you're going to go and you're going to learn how to make whiskey, and you're going to find a whiskey company. And I was not Googled, it wasn't back then. I was like Yahoo searching, whiskey stuff, and found out about Diageo. And I was like, all right, I'm going to work for them. And they didn't have an office in New Zealand. And, I was in Australia, for another reason, and I got a job. I was working bars, but I got a job with Diageo, and that was it. From the moment I joined up with Diageo in Western Australia, I was just like, right, to my boss, Peter Worsfold, I'd give a podcast shout out here. He was influential in my career. He's a West Australian AFL football player, really great bloke. And I said, look, I want to go to Scotland because my dream is to bring whiskey making back to New Zealand. And I feel like I need to go to Scotland to learn the trade properly. And after doing 4 years with Diageo and WA, he made it possible for me to get up to Edinburgh, and then it was gloves off. So,
wow, I might have known that about you at one point, but it falls into the mists of time, right? How people live their journey, and so Diageo got you up to Edinburgh. And so what were you doing? What was the job?
Well, in Edinburgh, or?
Yeah. Actually, both. I'm curious what you were doing in Western Australia and then also in Edinburgh.
Well, I was over there playing lacrosse. That was what I was doing, and I was supposed to see, weird segues with life. I was supposed to go to Japan and teach English and play lacrosse up there, and then that all fell through because in the Japanese lacrosse playing system, you have to be at training 5 days a week, and the people who were going to give me a job took one look and went, "No, that doesn't meet your visa conditions. Job done."
Oh wow!
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh shit, what's happening now?" And then, I went back to Western Australia because I'd been playing in a tournament there the year before, and I found a club and wanted to play at a better level, and so I was just there. It was straight first year out of uni, playing ball with the boys, working at bars at night time. It was carnage. I wouldn't want to live that again. I don't think I'd survive it, but I was lucky enough to get a job as like a little sales merchandiser. So my first proper adult job, and my dad's hilarious because when I left New Zealand. He was like, make sure you get yourself a proper job. He's a man of the tools. And, he didn't see bartending as a real thing. Even now, he sees me on my computer and I can just see him shaking his head. But so, yeah, I got this merchandiser job, and, my job was just to follow the sales rep after her calls to the different places and build, Johnny Walker promotional Smirnoff Ice displays. And then it became a sales job, and, then kind of went up the ranks, which was cool. And then when I went back, I came back to New Zealand before I went over, but when I came to Scotland, it was a weird thing, because my boss has said to me, we can get you to Scotland. We'll get you a job lined up on the other side, but you've got to get yourself your visa sorted. And I was just back then, I was 28, and the visa thing it clicked over when you're 28, so you couldn't get your traditional working holiday one, right? So I was doing interviews with distillery managers in Scotland. No Zoom, no Skype, just a phone, ringing them. Time difference. I remember speaking to the guy who was running Oban at the time, and I was like, yeah, I'd like to apply for your visitor centre job. And he's like, who is this? With my accent, right? I'm like, and I was giving him like the romantic spiel about wanting to learn how to make whiskey. I got laughed down the phone, and then I got hung up on. I'm like, fuck me, this is not working. So, just to add to the story, I came back to New Zealand. I spent 6 months with mum and dad, because I just was like, I'm just going to book the ticket. I'm going to go. I'm going to figure it out up there. And then, that I still needed a visa. So my girlfriend at the time, this lovely lady I was saying, was from Sweden, and she was just like, why don't we just get married? That'll sort your visa out. So,
oh no!
Yeah, so we did. I mean, the things you sacrifice for whiskey, right? So we went down to the registry office in Perth, and we did the marriage thing. We had to do practice vows. So the guy was standing there saying, right, now you say, I, Kylie Minogue, take you, Jason Donovan, as my lawfully wedded husband. And I had to say the reverse back. We got that done. I forgot to tell my parents. I didn't think anything of it. And then we were at the pub having a beer after. I thought, shit, I better tell Dad. So I've rung Dad. I'm like, oh, Dad, I'm down at the pub. He's like, oh, good. How's it going? I was like, yeah, good. Just let you know, I got married just now. It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. And he's like, okay. And I was like, it's just so that I can get up to Scotland and get on with this whiskey stuff. He's like, okay, yeah, no problem. Get it. And then like the little coward I was like, so you can tell Mum, right? And I got my bollocks kicked when I got home, but I got up to Scotland eventually 6 months later, and here I was, landed in Edinburgh and Whiskey World, and all the dreams were about to come true. And then I'd said, Worcestershire had lined up that I could go into operations. And so my expectation was, right, here we go. You've done your sales time. You're going into ops. and I turn up at the office, and they're like, right, so here's the keys to your car. You're going to look after this area called Perthshire and Tayside. I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, there's no ops roles available right now, but you can do some sales. And I was,
oh wow,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, and it was a bit of a punch in the stomach, because I was like, wow, what, this is what I came up here for. And then, you just roll with it, just get on with it. You're here, you got your visa, you're okay. You got just do it and figure it out. And I said, so where am I going? And they're like, Dundee. So okay, cool, all right. And that was a shock for Dundee, and that was a shock for me. First walked in the doors. So that I mean, this is, I know it's got a bit convoluted, but that's how I ended up in Scotland. And the first 6 months, I was a little shit. I spent most of my time, because my patch went all the way up to the Cairngorms, and then it went out across to just south of Aberdeenshire, and then all the way down the coast. And hey, there's some good distilleries in that bit of land. So I was absolutely, yeah, I was visiting them all. I'd be like, right, where's the next one? And then I'd look at my sales calls, and I'd try and cobble enough sales calls together to rip around the sales call so I could go up to the distilleries and spend some time. And I mean, it was hilarious because, you know, trying to plot a sales call, you know, around Dalwhinnie it's not a thing. And even for the pubs who were there, you know, people would take the call because they'd never seen a UDV rep before. They're like, check out this guy. It's the they didn't even know we're Diageo. They're like, it's the UDV guy. What's he doing?
Wow.
Yeah.
What a place to pitch up with them. But you got to see your Dalwhinnie. You pulled it off.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually a really good experience because I was spending that much time visiting these places and just because I was part of the company, I was being allowed in as a non-tourist, and you know, and as the guides understood that I was really there not just out of curiosity but out of passion, then I got to learn more just by asking questions and being told the spiel, which wasn't your standard visitor centre spiel. And the thing that I worked out pretty quickly was I'd make a terrible distiller and be useless at operations. So I kind of thought, well, you know, your job is, if you want to do this dream back home, is to learn the entire trade. Right? If you're going to build something in New Zealand, then you should really make the effort to learn the ins and outs of everything, because the distilling aspect of it, the warehousing aspect of it, I started to get a sense that it was just one key lesson. You shouldn't just go and learn to distill and then, you've got a functioning business. So it was a really, really great opportunity. So fun fucking.
I love the fact. I love the fact that even through all of that journey, you were still thinking about what you were going to return to New Zealand to build.
Yeah,
like your mind never, or maybe that's the question. At what point did your mind move away from?
Never.
Assuming it has.
Never.
Right.
Never. I think there's just been these moments where in my journey, I've taken the build a distillery idea and gone, okay, that's something that is still there, but you've got to focus on this because this is what you're learning now. But the you know, the South Star, so to speak, has always been, you know, get home and build. But also there's a bit where I feel like, because of the journey that I've been on, and it's been such a long one, it's been nearly 20 years now, and it's been through many different aspects. I think one of the things, and I suppose this will come up when we talk about Holyrood, is, you know, we're in this really brilliant space of new distilleries opening up all the time and people realising their dreams. And I think if you're going to be part of a new whiskey conversation, you've got to have something to say. And for me, thinking about New World and New Zealand and my journey, you know, there's definitely an immaturity at the start of it where it was just like, I want to learn everything about whiskey. And then as that happened and those realizations took place and it became more than just knowing what I like flavor-wise, but a bit more ops and all that kind of stuff, then it became actually more questions on why, apart from this idea, this calling that you had all those years ago. So, yeah, it's matured over time, I guess, is the right way of looking at it.
So I know there's more to the journey, and I know there's how we ultimately met. But with that mention of Holyrood there, you are now the managing director of this new distillery. And in our last episode of Extra, Josh and I were talking about the Falkirk distillery company, and they kind of started. There was a project a long time in the making. And then once they actually hit go on distilling, it was in a global pandemic. Here we are, you're managing director of Holyrood in a pandemic. I don't even have a question because it just seems absolutely mental. And so what are you seeing? What's that like up close and personal, being an MD in the teeth of a pandemic?
I mean, you guys always calling us colonials when you get yourselves in the shit, right? So, I mean, it's not pretty, but also I think, coming into Holyrood as in the role that I'm in, with the pressures that the business is under, what everyone's experiencing at the moment, it just puts a laser focus on what needs to be done. And I think one of those things which is where Holyrood has come on that journey was, the original business plan was really built around tourists popping over from the Royal Mile, coming down and seeing us, and and under any other condition, that's a really, really strong business plan. But what's happened with that kind of center of the world being taken away from us, it's meant that we've really had to examine quite quickly what it is that we actually are. And I feel that, as much as having a visitor center and knowing that those numbers de-risk your plan, help you lay down more stock, blah, 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 what had happened was it had shifted the focus away from what we truly need to be doing, which is being a whiskey producer. And by shifting the focus, I don't mean that what Holyrood wasn't a whiskey producer, because there was a lot of really, really good thinking about what we are to do and what our mission is, and the kit which was put in was built to reflect that. The thoughts which are at the heart of Holyrood from it was established was to focus on flavour, and the thoughts were not to cut any corners on production and bring to people the whiskies that they'd always have wanted to try. And all that rings true, but when you've got a massive expense like a visitor centre to run, you start compromising between those two things. And I think the business had just gotten itself in a bit of a tailspin, where it just wasn't sure on what had to be done. And so coming in, I have come in hot. I'm still fresh off the boat. It was 1st of January was my first day. It was really quite, in terms of the pressure, quite easy without the emotional connection to the business or the liquid or the journey, just to go, hey, it felt like a little bit like triage, right? Like you just you're like, right, okay, we're just going to lose that leg for now, and try and stitch your head back on, that's kind of what it felt like a little bit.
Gosh,
I've only had one coffee.
That's a visual.
I'll be very open. There was a point where the business was down in terms of cash flow. We were £22,000 in the bank, and that's a vicious place to be in.
Wow.
And one of the things which really I took really, really seriously was, here I am 20 years in my head molding the distillery I want to build, and here I'm talking to Rob Carpenter, founder of Scotch Malt Whisky Society Canada, and I'm watching his journey, which is a lifetime's journey in whiskey as well, imploding in front of his face. And there was just this deep call of respect for that journey that I felt, which was like, right, what can we do right now to save the business? And that's how we operate.
It's so interesting listening to you, knowing from your own journey that you would love to be in that position of building something. And then a moment ago where you just said, I had to go into this without the emotion, And so I'm thinking about how your own journey is reflected in this as you're trying to say, here's what we have to do financially. Here's how we recover from wherever we are. That's really telling. And the fact that you're busy saying okay, that leg, you're gone. Head, we got to get you reattached. And so what did that look like in whiskey terms? What have you done since January 1, if you're okay sharing that?
Yeah, 100%. Just to touch on that emotional piece, the divorcing the emotion was a little bit of just internalizing any worries and fears about just saying the hard thing. And then it kind of became reversed. It was like, I just felt we're not losing this thing. We will not lose this distillery. and that became the emotional driver. And it was like, we'll not lose this distillery, so I won't accept anything less than the hardest of conversations and truth, and really looking at these things honestly. And there will be no, just setting the table for everyone to say that there will be no acceptance of anything less than putting everything out there. And all the leadership team bought in on it. They're in a place where they're like, okay, no, we need to make some really strong decisions now. And then, I mean, it just went back to basics, really. It was like, what is our, without getting into boring finance speak, but what's our cash position? Where are we cash wise, and how much are we spending, and when is this all going to blow up in our faces? And external to the business, before I joined properly, still having conversations backwards and forwards. And the first early decision that I made before I was even in the business was shut everything down. Just shut it all down. Close. We're already closed in Brandholm because we had another lockdown, but it was shut ops, shut warehousing, shut production, close it all up, zero all of our costs as far as we can. And then let's try and get our feet underneath us, because we were just bleeding money. So we did that, and the team responded really well. I mean, we dropped that early, just like 1st of December. Everything was closed by mid-December, functionally as a business, and we went into stasis. And then,
wow,
in my head, it was in my head, it was like, right, well, forget about the Brandholm. That's the leg that got chucked away. That's not a thing for us to even think about right now. And the government gave us until end of April, which has now been extended till end of September, furlough. So everyone on the Brandholm side of the business, everyone went into furlough, but with the Brandholm people knowing that they would be the last to come out. And it was like, look, sorry team, if we can find other jobs for you to help in the meantime, but you're all on ice until we get this moving. And then it was like, okay, so Brandholm, that competing distraction from before, that's gone. Let's be a distillery. Right? We've got a fucking gin still that's been turned on 5 times. I'm like looking at this thing when I went there. I was like, first of all, I was like, what's this? And they're like, oh, that's our gin still. I'm like, how much gin are we making? And the answer's fuck all. I'm like, oh my God. So it was like, how can we use the assets that we have to our customer might not be a visitor coming through the Brandholm anymore, but our customer could be someone else. And so I have a 3-point plan, and I'll share it because it might help some other small distillers out there who are in the same pain as us. And this is something that I truly believe in, is whiskey community is a community. But the 3-point plan that we did was, we went, right, shut it all down. And the first one is what kind of partnerships can we do with people who might want to have whiskey that meets their needs? For all intents and purposes, fillings. And then the second bit was, once we had gotten through fillings, what partnerships could we do with indies? Because the way I looked at it, because this is part of my previous world, was I was looking at people who are in the broker side of the business or in the indie bottling side of the business, and the gripe is all the same. I can't get good liquid. It's overpriced. It's not the stuff that I actually want. My business is suffering because the people that I'm talking to actually know their stuff, and I can't get them liquid that makes them happy. And so, we're sharing one of them, and this is again whiskey community coming to the rescue. Doug McIver from Berry Brothers, I reached out to him. We see each other over the years, bump into him at various events, and have a quiet beer and a chat, as we all do. I said, look, Doug, these desperate fuckers have made me the MD of Holyrood. Can you help me out? I need to move some liquid. And we had this great conversation about, he wanted to get some liquid that was interesting that they could use for Berry Brothers. We have a kit that can be flexible, and one of the nice things for us is we're not in, because we're so young and we're the new wave of Scotch whiskey, we're not beholden to the old commercial models that the other malt whiskey distillers are geared towards. So, I said to him, we can make something for you at a volume which is probably going to meet your needs. And creatively, we went backwards and forwards, and we ended up, and we're running them at the moment. We're doing 3 new make styles, and we're focusing on yeast. We're doing champagne yeast. That just came off. That comes off this Friday, and next week we are on to Bordeaux. 2 weeks running that, and then the week after that we're on to Burgundy. And he was great. He's like, great, sign off. We can use that, and we can help pay and keep your lights going for you. So, we built a number of partnerships like that where, they've helped us keep the distillery alive and keep people in jobs. And then following on from that, it was indie collaborations like you and I. We've chatted about, can we play with yeast and can we play with barley and all of those kinds of things where we can speak to the independent whiskey community. I mean, I used to be as the MD of Hatton Brands for a while, and boutique whiskey was we do anything and everything. But I really grew a respect for independence the moment I started working in independent whiskey space. Whereas before, when I was at Morrison Bamore, we had Mike Keeler, our MD, who's like, buy all of our Bamore back and never sell to indies ever again. And indies are the death of our industry. And, it just was a really, a balancing view where I thought, well, we've got a kit where we can really make these, we can examine ideas and then we can bring them to an audience who wants these ideas examined. So that's the next part of the project. And the third bit is actually turn the gin still on and use it.
It's sitting there.
It's sitting there, but it's also, I said at the start, or I've been thinking, I don't know if I said at the start, I can't remember now, but we've got to have something to say. So if we're going to make a gin, what are we saying? And what are we saying in our space? And, I've said to the guys, our space isn't gin space, our space is whiskey space. So if we make something that is a gin, then let's make it from a whiskey maker's perspective. And let's put something out here which isn't I know there's lots of our brother and sister distilleries who put gins out there. I feel like if we're going to do it, we have to take a step beyond the narrative which is out there right now. And so that's where we're at with things.
Well, one of the things that Joshua and I were discussing, again, in talking about Falkirk, but just really talking about any new distillery, is there always seemed to be this 3-prong plan, and I really appreciate you sharing your in-house plan. From the outside looking in, it's having a visitor centre, it's having a place for people to eat or buy product, so they walk out the door having put money in your till. But then this third leg of the stool seems to be cask sales direct to consumers. And I believe that's a part of Holyrood as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and where you're at with that program?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of folds into our full cast program, right? So I kind of consider the bit where we're doing the work with Berry Brothers and then the work with Indies. Then this is just another arm of that, and it took a bit of work to get there because sometimes I'm nervous when I see cast programs being put out like that as a blatant cash grab. And,
Sure.
We're definitely doing it to raise funds for us to help us run our business, but at the same time, I was nervous of that space because I don't know how up to the play your listeners are with cask world, like that level of cask world right now. But there are lots of changes happening in the single cask trading game where it used to just be sell single cask to independent bottlers. Now they're in whiskey investment funds and prices being overinflated, and I'm really nervous about our whiskey going into that world, especially before it's come of age. So when we looked at that as a model, it was like, well, what are we actually trying to do here as a business? What is our mission? And it came to, after lots of backwards and forwards and lots of thinking about, those things I said earlier about flavor and quality and all of those things. Everyone's doing that in our space at the moment. And it felt like it wasn't really what our mission was. And it became clear that our mission really is to do all those things, but they just support the overall kind of unleashing of Edinburgh as a whiskey destination. And even when I say it, I came up with this unleashing Edinburgh's whiskey potential, which sounds a bit naff, but it also just, every time I hear it, I'm like, why this shit has no one built a distillery in Edinburgh before? Like, why have we, and I used to live in the city, I used to live in Leith, and like, why do we only have the Scotch whiskey experience? Now, I love the Scotch whiskey experience, but it just seems the obvious tack on is to build a distillery there. Now, running a distillery in Edinburgh, I know why a lot of people don't fucking do it, because it's so fucking expensive. It's a nightmare getting your effluent out and your grain in, and Jesus, that's a whole other thing. So when that became the realization that was our mission, then became a thing of, oh great, well we've actually got something that we could make, and we can put it out in casks, we can put it out at a price which isn't offensive to me personally, and hopefully to other people. And so we got to go on this really cool rabbit hole of making whiskey for ourselves to share with hopefully our friends and family and our fans. So we, it's live now. You can find it on our website. But we did this cool project where we're like, it was one of those whiskey chats. It was like, imagine if we did local barley. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, that'd be cool. It'd be great to find a local farmer and get local barley, blah, 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 blah. And then we've got this great kid, Elliot Rogerson, who's come over from Stewart's Brewing, who's part of our ops team. And Elliot's a brewer. He's like, I'm a brewer before I'm a distiller. And he's like, we've got to throw Edinburgh ale yeast in there. And we just went on this big, McEwen's and export kind of like rant about, just Youngers. It was cool. Like, I'm a beer geek as much as I'm a whiskey geek. And we're like pulling that apart, and like all of a sudden we went, holy shit, we've got something here. Because we're like, if the barley's from the city and the yeast, and Edinburgh yeast, if you look at them historically, they were passed backwards and forwards between the brewers. So the brewers, even with competing breweries, would share their yeast to help maintain consistency and fresh yeast and keep everyone's beer right. We're like, this is actually Edinburgh's story here right now in our hands, barley and yeast. And then there's a bit there where, because one of our mindsets is looking at one of the kind of challenges of throwing at the ops team is let's break whiskey. Let's break whiskey in Scotland. They're like, what? And I'm like, well, let's look at different ways we can achieve flavour. And so we're doing a lot of work on specialty malts at the moment. And, we've tried the chocolate malt, and we're starting to see things where, brewers' malts are giving us flavour profiles which work in the same way of taking the faints away as Islay whiskey, Islay peating levels do. So now all of a sudden we're like, oh man, if we took an old 80 shilling recipe and we toasted some of those barleys so that we could get that kind of roasty flavour coming through the new make, and then it just completed itself when we're like, well, what casks do we put it in? Because there's no Edinburgh casks. And then we were like, of course there is. Leith was a hub for sherry importation into the UK. So we just by talking and sharing, because everyone in my team, except for Rob and me and David, are all from Edinburgh, really. And so they're really proud of where they're from. And they've just been aching to speak about where they're from. And that's also a little bit about whiskey is right. There is a localization to it. There is a cultural fabric. There is all the energy, excitement of telling a story, and so that's what we put together. So, and that's part of that cast program.
Well, and this leads in beautifully to another conversation that Joshua and I had started in the extra episode, which is we're now witnessing a rise of the lowland region. The lowland region has been, depends who you ask, slowly or quickly dying over the last kind of period of time here. And then we see, obviously Glenkinchie held it up and Auchentoshan held it up. But then we saw the new ownership at Bladnoch. And then we saw the purchase and build of the Annandale distillery. And then we just talked Falkirk. Now we've got Holyrood. There's also the boys in charge of the Leith distillery.
Boddingtons and Crabbies.
Right, and I'm sure that we're going to see more as well. And so, yes, on one hand, you're telling this Edinburgh story, and I like it a lot, and I'll be following closely. But you're also part of a group representing a lowland region. And so for Holyrood going forward, do you see yourselves taking ownership of being lowland? Is that going to be less the story and the city's going to be more the story? What do your eyes see looking forward there?
just even listening to you there, I was like, fuck me, there is a lowland region worth of distilleries coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
So because that's not been our focus. Our focus, there's two things. There is making Edinburgh a legitimate whiskey destination that people who love whiskey will go to, but then there's another journey for us, which is I just call it earning our fucking stripes.
Mm-hmm.
Like we've got to earn it. Yeah, no shortcuts. We've got to earn our space. We've got a lot of tradition that we have respect for, and we've got a lot of I think opportunity not to step beyond that tradition, but do our own interpretation of where our journey is. And even as you say that lowland piece, my stupid brain's like, shit, you should be reaching out to all those boys after you get off this call and just say g'day, because one of the things we want to do is be way more collaborative. And we've started with the Indies and started talking. We got a great chat with Ali Walker. Him and I came up in different parts of Whiskey World together and stayed in touch during the years, and we got a chat going with you. But what I'd love to do is with this, and I just call them the small distillers in my brain, all of these new distilleries which are like fighting hard in this really tough space. I think there is a piece there where we can all work together to just tell our own stories, whether that's lowland or not.
Well, and that's the part that's interesting to us, because over the course of my journey since the mid-90s, I've only really seen the death of the lowland region. And it's quite nice now, almost 25 years into this, and yes, it makes me feel like an old fucker, but it's nice to be seeing the rebirth of something. And so when we saw Kilchoman open on Islay, well, gosh, you're Islay, and what a place to be. And you and I have talked about the role Islay played in our own burgeoning journeys. But then you saw Kilkerran, right, the Glengyle distillery, to keep Campbellton going as a region, and the J.A. Mitchell family and Headley Wright kind of giving two fingers to kind of region designation. But now it's been very easy to run away from being a lowland distillery, or having to work extra time to validate the region. Oh, you're grassy. Oh, you're light. Oh, you're vanilla. Oh, you're citrusy. Okay, tell me something new. And I think you are. I think with adding Edinburgh to that equation, and adding beer malts, conversation we've had with Trent Tilton at San Diego Distillery, or with Matt Hoffman at Westland, right? There's a role for beer malts and beer yeasts, wine yeasts. Kilchoman are now playing around with wine yeasts as well. So there's a whole world there that's not just your region, but also recognize your region and see how you could play that to a strength.
Absolutely. And when I think about the regionality of what you're talking about, for us, we look at it as a mindset. There's a lot there which we're trying to bring from our home. And, we've got a PhD project which we're doing with Harriet Watt at the moment, where we're working through how specialty malts work through the mashes and through distillation, and that's something that we're sponsoring ourselves. We cover all the costs on that operationally, nice. Just because Harriet Watt's part of our home, and brewing is part of our home, yeast understanding is part of our home, and even when you take a step back with Edinburgh, if you want to go full geek back to Edinburgh Enlightenment and the way that the city has got a very intelligent, questioning, curious approach to almost everything, then that becomes kind of our terroir, our mind terroir, if that makes sense. Where how do we? Because there's no way we could operate or act like an Islay distillery, but we can do our best to make whiskey that tastes like it. But what's the why? Why would we do that? And I think that's the most important thing we're aiming for is staying close to our why and staying true.
I'm so glad that terroir itself isn't controversial enough that you would go and throw mind terroir on top of that and just overly complicate this bloody conversation surrounding terroir.
I've thought about it. I've thought about it for so long, right? Like, and I do. I mean, I made mine terroir up there on the spot, but I feel like there's when I look at it and I think about it, I think, well, of course these whiskies all kind of taste in a similar style because you're going to have families who worked across different ones and who maybe work across two or three, or, you know, everyone's using similar raw materials from a similar place, or there's knowledge. Like whiskey is, you know, I love the bit which we get to control as humans, the bit that we get to engineer and work towards, and the boundaries which we give yeast to work in, and the cuts that we get to make, and all of that kind of stuff. I love we put all that work in, and then we just kind of give it up to God and chuck it in a cask and go, cool, well, let's see what happens now then. It's brilliant. It's just brilliant. And so, like, that's gonna. I might keep mine terroir actually because just trying to keep those ideas of well, where does here? Why do we make? I've got one of my best friends, Duncan McRae. He used to be at William Grant's, and you know, he's brilliant to talk about the thinking of things, and you know, he's an outstanding marketeer. But he's a whiskey man through and through, and he's constantly asking the why. And it's a powerful question to ask when you're making stuff, because if you're not making it traditionally, then your why has got to be clear. And I mean, it can be a why of passion because I love it, or it can be a why of exploration because I want to know more. But I think, you know, if we with all the new distillers and all the new world whiskey markets, whiskey producers coming on, you know, that examination of why seems to me to be the mind terroir which connects us all. Yeah.
So a minute ago, you were just talking about Atom MD, that boutique whiskey company, and you've got this, I think, quite unique position of having been on both sides of the IB divide, the independent bottler divide. And so what did you expect going into independent bottling, and then what did you learn while you were in there?
Yeah, it's a massive question. I didn't have that bigger expectations on the IB stuff when I first turned up at Atom, mostly because I didn't understand boutique. Like I didn't get it. I think there's a bit of me, you know, there's still a little bit of me which in some ways can be a bit traditionalist, and you know, I was looking at the labels, and I didn't get the in jokes, and I was kind of like, what? I don't get what's happening here. And then also the OG job was to get as many whiskey advent calendars out there as possible, and also build bathtub gin. But then as I was traveling around the world and opening up the export markets, you know, my distributors would be naturally drawn to boutique because they'd had enough of gin. They're like, well, yeah, okay, bathtub, blah, let's talk about boutique. And I think that's where I really started to get under the skin of IBs properly. I mean, we'd done, you know, I used to work in Scandinavia for half a decade working whiskey up there, where, you know, that's where I first met Doug McIver from Berry Brothers, and we did a bunch of stuff with Stuart Thompson from over at Ian McLeod, and we'd do the Chieftains, and we'd do bottlings, right? But I don't think you really get an appreciation for the power of the conversation that an indie has until you're actually working as part of an indie. And you know, we had, it was really nice. It was always about the whiskey, which is always my favorite conversation. You know, it was never, I think what I learned was that our labels and our way of putting things out there, it made a kind of break with the heritage storytelling that you do as a brand owner. Sure. And I think with an indie, I think people, you know, your whiskey fans, which are coming to try your whiskeys, they're really, there's a lot of trust between that relationship of the people who buy from indies and the liquid that an indie has to get their fans. And the fans, you know, they live and die by quality. And so then your job becomes really easy in theory, which is get great quality for an acceptable price. And that was really revealing. And I think there's a lot that brand world and indie world can learn from each other. And I think, I've brought that mindset into what I'm doing at Holyrood, is that having a strong relationship with the indies, you can look at it as commercially advantageous because that's a great thing to do for our business. But at the same time, and its wholeness and fullness, I'm not just saying this because you're an indie, but it is something where you can have these really powerful conversations. It's the whiskey fans who are buying from indies who have got the most to say about the category. And while they make up the smallest part of whiskey purchases, they're also going to tell you all of the red flags are the things which are wrong with the industry or stuff that they're not happy with, and the stuff that really needs to be paying attention to. Because if they're thinking it, 10 years later, mainstream's thinking it. It was the whiskey geeks who discovered Japanese whiskey first. Now my bogan lacrosse mates are drinking Nika from the barrel, and I'm like, oh shit, maybe it's time to move on. It's a little bit it's a little bit like that, right? So, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it felt like a revelation more than anything. And for Atom, boutique became the mainstay for our export business. That was where the real opportunity was for us, was going out there with a bit more of a modern thinking indie bottler who had, what we wanted to do was bring exceptional liquid regardless of where it was from to the world, and that we wanted to build a trust relationship with our fans that when we put something on the table, that whether it was from Australia or Switzerland or Finland or Germany, that they go, okay, cool, well, I trust these guys. If they're putting it here, then it's something worth me having a look at. And that's also why we built out the small bottle set, so we could also make that. We just kept trying to make good liquid accessible. So yeah.
But it's so interesting when you talk about trust, and absolutely, Joshua and I agree with you on that wholeheartedly. And it takes a while to build up trust, and you can lose it all too quickly. And so trust is hugely important. But it's interesting to us when it comes to some of the larger brands who have no interest in independence and don't see the value of their brand. It's not even their brand, it's just their distillery being in another's hands. And so for you with Holyrood, it's really wonderful to be having a conversation just like we've had with Glen Murray, just like we've had with Arran and Westland, Wild Turkey. It's wonderful to have these conversations where somebody actually sees the value in us, and then we can partner on interesting projects. So that's a little bit of a watch this space at this time, but I thoroughly enjoy the conversations that we've been having, and knowing that, yes, you're in charge of a distillery, but you also see the value an independent bottler brings to the table.
Yeah, and there's a maturity in the markets which is happening at a rapid rate, because the exchange of information now and the transparency of information just makes it a lot easier to take yourself from I've got a passing interest in whiskey to being feeling quite educated on your palate.
I tell you, man, if you ever launch a podcast, you're coming after One Nation Under Whiskey, because you have just set up the perfect transition into our listeners in Australia and New Zealand reaching out to us. And we had a question actually in the Bill Lumsden episode, which was, how much do you, Jason and Joshua, know about Australia and New Zealand producers, distillers? And we were busy saying in that episode, Josh and I had been hoping to get down there, as we like to call it, sometime in 2020. It didn't work out. Who knows what 2021 is going to look like? But we are hearing from more and more people that there's a scene and there's a fanaticism. And our good friend Lee Atwood at Backwoods Distilling in Australia, we've spoken with him on the podcast. So you're a Kiwi, you're a man with an eye on ultimately one day, sometime in the future, getting that New Zealand distillery going. What are you seeing down there? And are you surprised by it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm back home now, right? So I'm not in Scotland. I'm back in New Zealand, and I've kind of I feel like I've discovered what's happening here, because for so long it's been from afar, and now I'm home, and I'm able to go and visit some of these places. So in terms of discovering, I think in terms of New Zealand and Australia, I think New Zealand for some time has been quite far behind Australian whiskey making. And I was speaking to a brilliant compliance fire safety specialist, a guy called Rex, a few weeks ago, with the intention of my own place. And I thought, well, now's the time to actually start while you're in the country. Why don't you speak to these people? And one of the reasons he held up there for the lag between New Zealand and Australian whiskey was distilling was so poorly understood in New Zealand as an actual thing that the law didn't exist within the country on how to govern it. So, if you dive into our whiskey history in the 1860s, we had, most of our population that came out here were from Scotland, our British population, and they brought with them their whiskey making traditions. And, it took about 20 years before they started building bricks and mortar distilleries. So we had one in Auckland called Crown and one in the South Island called Dunedin Distillery. And these were proper distilleries. They had markets in the country, and they had a tax advantage versus Scotch, which was being brought in, so they're undercutting the Scotch market. And then there's a great legend in New Zealand distilling, our tiny little circle now, where at the time the story goes that Richard Seddon, who's Prime Minister, wanted to borrow money from the Bank of England to fund the railway development in the country. Bank of England had just funded like a land war here, so they said, on you go. So he went to the Bank of Scotland, and the Bank of Scotland, with its deep pockets in whiskey, said, well, you've got a protective tariff, take that away and we'll lend you the money. And then within 3 years, all of the distilleries were gone. Now, I can't find the evidence to this, but this is how legends are born. I'd love to release a whiskey called Revenge or something like that. So, but you fast forward all the way to now. But that shutting down in the industry then, only came back when we had Willowbank Lammerlaw, now known as New Zealand Whisky Company. Then that disappeared in '97 in a corporate takeover. So what I learnt was that it was at a council level that distilling regulations were set, because the central government level was borrowing legislation that they had cut and pasted from Australia. And that had been something that the New Zealand whiskey scene had to play their tune to up until the mid 2015, when all of that legislation got put under health and safety. And you can hear me tremble and shiver, because health and safety, what they said is, no, this is one, these are chemicals, and two, this is an explosive substance. So all the distilleries that were being onboarded then, all these plans were slammed with having to meet these explosive proof building codes just to operate. And we all know that's not what happens with distilleries. So just like shining a torch on that, this kind of rapid renaissance of New Zealand whiskey distilleries coming through now is because that legislation has been removed and it's been replaced with common sense.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And so what we're seeing is, like, what I'm seeing is these distilleries, which have kind of just been these little whispers of things, are actually really becoming things. So there's Matt Thompson and his place, and he's doing his work. He's a pioneer of what we have back home. But I came home with my partner Liv. Right, she's from, like I said, she's from Gloucestershire, and where I live in New Zealand, we're way out in the country. Like, it is so isolated out here. There's got to be 20 people in the village, and it is really it's great being home. But she's a little bit like, so we left London and
there are hobbits running through the backyard.
I've got to show this girl my country. I've got to show her my home. So I took her to Waiheke. And Waiheke, for those who don't know, is an island in Waitemata Harbour, which is Auckland's harbour, where all the Americans' Cup yacht racing is at the moment. And it's most well known for being really kind of a place where people who are a bit out there, a bit green, bit go your own path, like to go. That was originally it. And now it's got some of the country's best vineyards on it. So it's a really cool place to go. Like, it's not very big. And so find good eating, but really laid back, great wines, all that kind of thing. And I had in my head, I was like, there is some people out there called Waiheke Whiskey. So I hit them up on Instagram, and there's like fuck all posts. So I just thought, I'll just send them a message. I was like, hey, look, I'm interested in coming and seeing you distill it. All of you whiskey geeks listening to the show right now know exactly what I'm doing. I'd like to come and see whiskey. I thought, I'll lay it on a bit thick. I work in Scotch whiskey, blah, blah, blah. And I get this lovely... I get this lovely message back halfway through the holiday, or just before we arrive, saying, "Oh, hey, we hardly ever check Instagram. Tick. If you want to stop by, we're going out for beers this afternoon, but we'll be around the distillery tomorrow, and it's here." So I've asked Liv. I said, "Look, do you want to go?" And she's like, she's never been to one before, and she's just sees my whiskey life as this kind of thing which makes me hungover sometimes, and so she's like, "Yeah, that'd be cool." So we've toddled along. It was in between. It was right next to Motu Vineyard, which was one of the big vineyards, and there's a shed up the back, and we've just driven up, and we met Rosie, who was outside on her phone, and she's just like, "Yeah, I'll be with you in a second." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's cool. We're here," and we've kind of just walked into this thing, and there's this weird ass still sitting on the side, which I'm speaking to this bloke who's speaking a million miles a minute about how proud he is of his whiskey, and then I've clicked that shit. This guy Mark, he's the actual founder. They've got all their casks out, all 70 of them, and they're busy. They're taking samples on each of them, and Mark's like, "Did you see the spirit still?" And I'm like, "I can't see the spirit still actually." He's like, "Oh, it's just outside." And I'm like, what the fuck is it doing outside? Of course it's outside. So we've walked outside, and he's got this spirit still. And I mean, they've only just put up their website, so you can find it there. There's nothing on social. I mean, you can find it on my social. There's all these video feeds. So if you look me up, you want to see it, it's all there. But they had this idea where he was making whiskey in a garage. It was his passion. He's a surgeon, so he has a really tough normal life. He's like, normal life for me isn't that like it's hard, and so I put all of my energy into this thing where I get to create and I get to make, and he got this guy who's one of his mates, and I call him Whiskey Jesus because that's what he looks like. And this engineer, kind of American techie dude, I forget his name. He's like, "Right, you need to make these like hexagonal still," and they've made this like still which is made of all these triangular panels. They've done it in a vacuum. Like they've just done this stuff themselves. And this is typical Kiwi number 8 wire attitude. Like, "Oh yeah, she'll be right. We'll make it." And so I'm looking at this thing, and I can see all this epoxy resin down the seams because it shits itself every now and again, and it'll blow a rivet, and then like vapor will go out the side. And even Rosie's like, "Check out this video from when we did our first distillation," and they've got it running. I'm looking at this video from 10 years ago, and then you hear them go, "Oh shit, it's leaking," and it's. So I'm just like, I am loving this. I am like, this is incredible. You didn't get a bunch of cash and go up to Forsyth and just slap down a whiskey distillery. You had no idea what you're doing. You built it yourself, and I was like, what a beautiful story. And there's like this. So we got into the liquid, and Mark. He's like, he's like, "We're just doing peat. Peat's what I love." And he kept showing me his like French oak unpeated stuff. He's like, "Nah, don't like it," and chucking it on the ground. and then we go through his peat one. I just was like, holy shit. I just said, you make me really proud to be a Kiwi. This is a whiskey because the quality's there. The passion's there, the mission's there, the vision is there, even the street cred to build this yourself, right? Like it's all this beautiful new world journey. Like it made me think of Chip Tate and him building his stills, and I was like, do you know about Balcones? He's like, "Bell what?" And then it's like, mate, fuck me. So we've got all these little distillers. Now they're not all like Mark on Waiheke whiskey, but we've got these very small projects which they're very closely tied to the land. So, there's one which I've seen called Lammermoor, which is on a farm in the South Island in the deep south, and they're growing their own grain because that's what they've always done, and they just were like, look, we want to do this thing, and I've got a lot of respect for these small distilleries who are really trying to walk their own path. I mean, Matt Thompson, he's done some work on Manuka. So Manuka, most people are familiar with it as the honey, but the wood that we use it to smoke fish. It's got this beautiful aromatic flavors to it. Yeah, and so he's looking at that direction, and then Mark over in Waiheke, he's really focusing on New Zealand peat. New Zealand peat's completely different than what you get in Scotland. Basically, the centre of the North Island is a giant peat bog, which is full of like Cody forests and all these podocarp forests which have fallen in there over time. So there is this sweet gentleness to our peat, which he just, it doesn't have the heather fragrance, and it doesn't have, or the peat he's using at the moment doesn't have that kind of sea iodine depth to it. It has this really interesting round middle ground. And so there's, and what I do like is these distillers are spread up and down the country. So they know each other, but they're very beholden to different terrains and environments. Distilling in the deep south, Cadrona down there right next to the ski field is a much different proposition to distilling on Waiheke, which has, almost a subtropical microclimate. And the maturation spaces that, we got, and where Mark is, your maturation space is going, his angel share is about between 15 and 18%, whereas, all the way down in the deep south, you're looking at more Scottish maturation. So I think there's lots of interesting things which are starting to come, but there's also this, New Zealand, what I found in exploring New Zealand whiskey makers is this, like, we're making whiskey, but what now? Like, there's, do you think people will want to buy this overseas? I was on the phone with Mark last night, and he's like, do you think I could export it? I was like, mate, are you fucking kidding me? Yeah, of course. Like, because we're so far away. We're so far away, right?
Yep.
I mean, here's a story. So he's telling me that they shanghaied themselves down to Whiskey Galore down in the South Island, and they took Whiskey Jesus with them, and he's clanking around with some of their spirit, and they hadn't paid for a stand, and Mark was like, look, just whatever you do, don't speak to anyone. Like, we've got the spirit here, we'll just show it to a few people, and we'll try and get some validation. But the bottles were making so much noise that one of them took his tramping socks off and goes, just put the bottles in there. And I know I'm stealing Mark's thunder, but he said, Nick, the next thing I knew was in walks Dave Broom. Dave's walking in with his entourage of followers, or like Dave Broom, and then I turn around and there's Whiskey Jesus handing him the stinky tramping sock. And I was doing what you do. I was just losing it. And apparently, to his credit, Dave's taking it out, tastes it, and goes, "It's pretty good." and then Whiskey Jesus goes, "You can keep it and keep the sock." And they walked off. And he's doing
Oh, we're talking to Dave real soon. We'll have to ask him about that.
Just ask him. Yeah, 100%. So, here in New Zealand, there is, I think, as a summary, there are a number of very interesting producers. Some are tying their journey back to, we've had a moonshine period here as well, where the Scots and their children would make the whiskies that they used to make back home. Remember, they came off the clearances, right? So they're coming straight from making whiskey that way in the Highlands, them just doing it over here. So there's the South Island distilleries are really touching on that. Reefton's got a really good heritage. I mean, I have been in Whiskey Geek heaven because I've discovered like the National Archive of Newspapers has now been digitized. And so I've been looking for moonshine, but that wasn't what it was called. It just called it, in those papers, it's called illicit stills. And so there's all these brilliant references of these pockets of Scots and Irish immigrants getting busted with their illicit stills. and then, here we are today with that journey to look back on. And then there's other more progressive distillers. I'd say Matt Thompson, he feels very, very progressive, and Mark at Waiheke, he's really zeroed in on what he wants to do. He's like, I just want to explore peat. That's what I love. I want to explore New Zealand peat. I want to do it on my island. I want to see how this all hangs together. And that's
Smart.
That's cool. But it also differs from that Bill Lark influence that I see with Tasmanian distillers. There's different mindsets, very individual mindsets, and people have come into their whiskey journey in different ways, which I think is fascinating and is going to make for a different kind of here we go mind terroir for
Oh, could have given you a drum roll in the lead up to that as well.
Yeah, for New Zealand whiskey making. I mean, going out to see Mark at Waiheke, when we did that, I mean, Liv and I spent the better part of a morning with him. This is the other bit, and then the next day he's like, mate, just want to come around for brekkie and coffee. And then we went around and he's like, oh, should we go down on the beach and go for a paddle? And that's the Kiwi way. And then we had caught up with him for dinner the next night, and of course there was whiskey chats, but it was just chats, and the whiskey was part of the conversation, but it wasn't driving the conversation. It was just part of the fabric of the world, and I think that's also something which will set us apart as hopefully a whiskey producing nation. It's definitely something that I want to bring into my distillery when I get the chance to do it.
Well, Joshua and I have said it before, and we'll say it again. We cannot wait to get down there and explore this and meet the people and just have those chats and taste those whiskies and observe the points of difference, but also be out and about again and seeing other human beings and learning stories. Just like, I love the opening of this chat with you, where learning your story is what this is all about. And I want to do it more and go and see more people, but one day.
It was nice to be a fly on the wall of your conversation with Nick.
Thank you.
As much as I would have loved to have been there, and in all honesty, I really would have loved to have been there. I was desperately looking forward to this because you're right. Every time we had a meeting scheduled, something would pop up. I already had something planned, or whatever, family stuff, whatever the case is. And so I was really, really looking forward to this. I'd cleared my calendar, everything, and then, nature happened. But what a brilliant conversation. And I see what you say. He's just easy. He's just easy.
Oh, yeah. Failingly honest, straightforward, transparent. Discussing the future plan for Holyrood was absolutely captivating. But then also you've got a chap who's not afraid to talk about his own hopes and dreams for the future, even beyond Holyrood, to be so dedicated and to be so in the moment with Holyrood, but then also talking about what a future return to New Zealand would look like, building his own distillery, operating his own distillery.
Yeah.
Like it's wonderful to hear that, and wonderful to encounter that level of honesty as well. And as I said a moment ago, transparency.
Well, yeah, I mean, the fact that you mentioned that sort of looking to the future, I thought that end bit was in and of itself a slightly different conversation. And so I'm actually going to, just so you're aware and so the listeners are aware, I'm going to detach that from the entire conversation. So after we're done, you'll hear what Nick is looking forward to, and there's a good few minutes dedicated to that conversation.
Well, the good news, he talks about a future that is more than just that.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
And so it was, he gave a thoughtful answer to the question, which we always appreciate. So we'll return to Nick a little later in this episode. But in the meantime, better wake up the paperboy.
Extra, extra! Read all about it! Life story of Playboy Penny! Extra, extra! Extra, extra! Read all about it! Me and that Playboy in trouble again! Extra.
I'll tell you what's not fake news, Joshua.
Oh, could it be alternative facts?
I tell you what's not alternative facts, Joshua.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Go ahead.
We have been celebrating a 4-month suspension of the punitive 25% Trump tariffs on Scotch whiskey.
That is so... Let me add really quickly, really quickly. When you read that news, maybe it wasn't at that moment, because I think I woke you with that news. I texted it to you. What did you pour in celebration?
It's not so much what I poured in the moment, it's what I haven't stopped pouring since. What was interesting, and you are right, I did wake up to the text from you, and in the SWA, Scotch Whisky Association press release, they talked about the 16 months that the tariffs had been in place. I had a hard time believing it was as few as 16 months.
Feels much
It has
longer.
felt like 3 years, partly because the tariffs ended up on top of a pandemic.
Yeah.
But the whole thing, the whole enterprise felt a lot more than 16 months. And, if people go back in time from the future and they look at this 16-month period, as one reads that in the future, it'll just simply look like a blip on a radar.
Yeah.
And yet, living through it partly because it never felt like it was going to end. And even when it quote unquote ended, it's still only a suspension. So the sword of Damocles does continue to dangle above us.
Yes, it does.
The sword of Damocles is hanging over my head. And I've got the feeling.
And one of the things we have done, and a number of our partners, both in Scotland and in the United States, have reached out with the news to say, hey, let's move. Let's do things. Let's get going. Let's stop this pause. Let's stop this slowdown. Let's get back to business. And with Brexit now happening east and south of the United Kingdom, we have some temporary relief west of the United Kingdom.
Right. And at least in my mind, I'm treating it as 4 months. I don't necessarily believe that they're going to be lifted permanently. I do fear that they're going to come back. So with that in mind, you and I, as soon as we heard this news that the tariffs were being paused, we said, okay, now let's take a look at what our next retail release is going to look like. Let's take a look at what our next 2 U.S. retail releases are going to look like, because we have this 4-month window in which to get it over to try to, start selling whiskey at prices that the prices they're meant to be. And so without giving any details of the release itself, know that we've solidified release number 7, 6 different casks in there. And we are getting close to finalizing what release number 8 for the U.S. will look like. So it's exciting. It's exciting times. And in a way, I'm slightly thankful for 4 months. I'm slightly thankful for this fear that they'll return, because it's lighting a fire under our asses to make sure that we're really taking care of business here and getting the whiskey stateside ASAP.
I'm just looking at all the samples we selected sitting on my desk here, and just being excited after, release 6 was whenever release 6 was, and then to start this year we had 6.5, which is we call that internally the Harry Potter release, even if it's not quite 6 3/4 or 9 3/4. But looking at the 7th, eyeballing the 8th, working with Jess on Rest of the World release 3, and then also working with a kind of a new hire who has not yet been announced but will in due course, working on casks for the cask pick program as well. So gosh, there's a lot of whiskey and rum floating around within Single Cask Nation at the moment. And I think you'll be okay with me teasing this, but this new brand that we're looking at launching Q3, third quarter after the summer, that's not going to be impacted by tariffs either, so long as they do go away and they don't unpause after 4 months. And that's really, really good news. And that will become clear to the listeners once the launch comes about. It will become clear why there's no room for tariffs there.
Indeed. Yeah, indeed.
But I'm excited to move forward, Joshua.
As am I. Speaking of moving forward, that's really all the news we have. So I'd like to move forward to the mail portion, because we actually got in a few emails. There's 2 I wanted to highlight for this episode, or I should say there's 2 that we wanted to highlight for this episode. And then there's actually a third one that's definitely worth reading, but because Nick's interview is a bit longer than some of the others, we're just being cognizant of your time, dear listener. So Jason, did you want to read the first bit of email?
If listeners recall back in our mailbag episode, we got a couple of emails from Jigs over in the Philippines.
Yep.
And those were lovely emails, and we thoroughly enjoyed covering them. And Jigs wrote in. And I'm not going to say why Jigs wrote in, because I'm going to read the email and make it clear why Jigs wrote in. So Jigs writes, "Hello again, J, and J. Parentheses, see, I'm not drunk. Ha ha. That's the spirit. I can get behind that. Then into the email. I listened to your mailbag episode a few days after you posted them, and I'm writing now to thank you for the time you gave to answer them being his questions. The answers you provided have been eye-opening! Exclamation point.
Oof. Look at that.
That's high praise.
You meant it. I like that.
Now, I realise that the central consideration when choosing between an OB and IB, official bottling and independent bottling, should not be the retailer, but the character of the spirit. After all, both kinds of bottlings only offer different experiences of the same distillery's spirit, regardless of how that spirit was acquired or matured. Marvellous. And I love the fact that Jigs gives marvellous its own sentence. That's wonderful. Thanks to you guys, I no longer need to buy cream to fix up these burning questions. I look forward to the next time I get to participate in your conversations. I wish you all the best with the podcast and with SCN. Cheers, Jigs. That's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. In returning to the middle portion of Jigs' email here, where he writes, I realise that the central consideration when choosing between an OB and an IB should not be the retailer but the character of the spirit. My take there is, instead of the word retailer, I think what Jigs is going for is the person doing the selling. Whether it's coming from a distillery, whether it's coming from an independent bottler, pay attention to the character of the spirit. Don't be so focused, because he does go on to say, regardless of how that spirit was acquired or matured. Let the spirit speak for itself. Let that cask represent itself.
Right.
So don't be swayed by, was it distillery? Was it an independent? But instead say to yourself, what's going on in here? What's happening?
This reminds me of something that, and as soon as I say this person's name, you're going to know exactly what I'm about to say. Our good friend Gene Sharness from Warehouse Liquors will always say to us, don't let facts get in the way of flavor.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And that's what I'm hearing here. And I'll tell you really quickly before we go to the next email, I was in a Pandaren tasting just the other day, and David Cover, who we've had on the pod before, was talking to us about the various casks that they have in their store. And, their stuff is verging on 21 years now. Come September, they will have 21-year-old Pandaren sitting in their warehouse. And he was telling us, and he actually may have mentioned it in the podcast, that, him and Mike Wheeler and I think Ista, who's their master blender, went through and tasted a bunch of the old casks, the 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old stuff. And now here's where he needs facts getting in the way of the flavor. He said this, the 16, 17, 18-year-old stuff was delicious, but it could have been from anybody. Right? At that point,
interesting.
The whiskey lost its Pandaren-iness. And so in his case, he needs the facts to be there. And if that Pandaren-iness is gone, how do they tell that story about that cask, right? And you can tell it. It's just how do you want to tell that story? So I guess you can look at it in a couple of different ways.
Well, I think it maybe speaks to that tradition of Scottish independent bottling where you do want to know the distillery. You do want to know who produced this, as well as when they produced it and how they stored it, how they matured it. Those are important details, but you certainly shouldn't be swayed by whether it's coming from an official distillery line,
definitely not, no.
or an independent line.
Definitely.
Having said that, and we've discussed this many, 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 many times, you do want to purchase from independent bottlers with whom you share a similar palate. That's just common sense in how you spend your money. But thinking that either official or independent, one is better than the other, I don't think holds water. And that's what we got into in the answer we gave in the mailbag too, Jakes.
Exactly. Beautiful. Cool.
So, next.
So the next question is from a newer listener, a guy by the name of Ben Smith.
Okay.
The subject reads, Ushkaba or Ushkabeta. Wait, there's Ushkaba, but what's the two words? Ushkabeta?
That's pronounced ba. Beathehe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pronounced ba.
Okay, so usually when I've seen Ushkaba, it's been like the blend, like the Ushkaba blend, where it's all one word. So I didn't know if when it's separated into two words, if it had a slightly different pronunciation. Okay.
No, and here's the funny thing. See, whenever I say Ushkaba, in my head, I'm imagining two words.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yep.
So it's like whiskey and whiskey then. There you go. Okay. So the subject is Ushkaba / etymology of whiskey question.
This is going to get controversial real fast.
Real fast. Hi, Joshua and Jason. Well, no, I'd say you started off pretty well there. I'm a whiskey-obsessed American who lives in Scotland and recently became one of your newest devoted listeners.
Welcome.
Welcome indeed. You both really dig into the topics and questions that are near and dear to my heart, and I thank you for it. I preface my question by first asking for forgiveness if the following is already covered ground, as I've yet to listen to every episode in the treasure trove that is your archives. All right, here's
that makes two of us, Ben.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It occurred to me that Jason's pronunciation of the word whiskey begins with an H sound, much like the character Stewie on Family Guy pronounces Will Wheaton, and similar words beginning with a W.
Cool whip.
Cool whip. Wheat then. And he goes on, he says, whereas I haven't often noted the same pronunciation of the word whiskey here in Scotland, I couldn't help but notice that Dr. Bill Lumsden's diction is similar to Jason's. Whereas,
Thank goodness. Okay. Vindication this day.
where did Bill say he's from? He's not from Glasgow.
He didn't.
Oh,
he didn't.
Yeah, that is definitely not a Glaswegian accent, but...
No, he's not. No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, anyway. Whereas I know and understand that Dr. Bill's vast knowledge, expertise, and accomplishments could never hold a candle to that of Jason's, hearing them both say whiskey in that way got me to thinking. All right, so this is him setting up for the question, right? Hearing the two of you say whiskey instead of whiskey. Right, there's your setup. And now he says, now we all know that Gaelic for aquavitae is uskaba, and that this eventually morphed into the word whiskey. Call it an epiphany, but I've only just now realized that ushka begins with the same H sound that Jason and Dr. Bill put before whiskey. Ushka. Yeah, it's like a you have to breathe into it. Like a whiskey, huskaba. That's interesting. So, here he goes. In only just now connecting these dots, I ask, have I been butchering the word whiskey all this time?
Yes.
And then he asks, and then he digs deeper. To be righteous and pure, must we all henceforth follow Jason's lead and only do as he does in things? WWJD, what would Jason do?
I tell you, that's what it's always been. Some people turn that into another use.
I tell you, Ben.
But for me, it's always been what would Jason do?
Ben is really stroking your ego here. He's stroking your ego big time.
That would explain why my ego just became so big.
Need a moment to yourself? Anyway.
Yeah, let me just grab a cushion.
You didn't pull out that ego for air. So terrible. I don't know if I'll keep that one in.
I like that one.
I did too. So he goes on. Well, we're not done yet. We're not done. Lastly,
if this lasts longer than 4 hours, I'm going to have to seek medical intervention.
And this really is the most important part of the.
Okay, so he's about to use your name. Okay, carry on.
Lastly, and this is a question specifically for Joshua.
Predictable.
Although I know it's more of a request, can you please make Jason say Will Wheaton like a lot, as in a whole bunch of times on your upcoming episode? Jason, to your knowledge, have there been any known actors who've worked with stone brewing in the past?
He's a Star Trek guy, right?
Yeah. Wesley Crusher. Sorry, Wesley Crusher.
I was thinking more Leonard Nimoy, but anyway, it's not Leonard Nimoy.
It's Will Wheaton.
Oh, Will Wheaton.
Will Wheaton.
Will Wheaton. Yeah, around our house we always say, you still working on that book? You still working on that book? So it got characters in it. Other characters. Is there a story? Are you writing a story? Are you building a story? That's the one we always quote around this parts. But however, Cool Whip is definitely something that we all lean on around these parts. Cool Whip.
And now I'm going to end his email. He says, many thanks. Ciao for now. And he spells now like ciao, but with an N instead of a C.
I can get behind that.
and there's a PS, because there's always a good postscript to any good email.
Okay.
I'm glad that we all agree Corey is better than Oogie. It never ceases to amaze me how many people in this world get that wrong. Now, if only we could decide if shampoo or conditioner is better, I might finally be able to get some sleep at night. That was fun.
Oh, that was excellent.
Yeah,
That was good. That
good,
was well done.
good fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So do I pronounce it funny? Like, as you're going around in your whiskey world, are you drawn to
All the time? Every word that has a WH in it, you pronounce with an HW.
My safe word will be whiskey.
Sorry, Rod, what was that?
Whiskey.
So you mean whiskey?
What?
You're saying it weird.
Saying what weird?
All of it.
Where do you get off?
I just don't get why you're saying it that way.
Why I'm saying what way?
Forget it.
I will forget it.
Like when you say what?
do I say what?
You just did?
It's interesting because my brother would always pronounce the word open as if the E and the N had been reversed in it.
Like opne?
But like it would never be quite that horrific. But it would always sound reversed. It was always the weirdest sound, and he didn't really do it with any other words. But open is always a word that I remember my brother pronouncing kind of funny. And so I don't really think about where I'm putting my emphasis on my WHs, but just when you talk about the HW seems to be the order of them. It's interesting.
You just did it. You just said, just when you talked about doing it's all the time.
It's so tough because I get such compliments on this accent, but yeah, the fact it's making me sound like a dumb fuck might be maybe people are just patronizing me. What else? No, I'll also go on to say this will now have me fixating, because in the mailbag episode, who was it that wrote in about the use of rich? Was that Balancer?
That was Balancer, yes.
Yeah. And so I have now paid attention to almost nothing besides our use of rich. Or if I'm watching TV and someone uses rich,
I know.
I am so hyper fixated on rich that maybe this email from Ben is just what I needed to get rich out of my head. And now I'll focus on the WH.
I kind of like the WH. I mean, it makes you sit. It just makes you sound like you may have more money than me. I kind of like that.
Okay. It's quite the opposite of dumb fuck. Although we live in a world where apparently all the dumb fucks have the money. Something's gone horribly wrong in the world.
Something's gone horribly wrong. But yeah, it has this kind of like, smart people wear glasses kind of feel to it.
Oh gosh. Okay. I will reinvest my efforts in acquiring more tweed to go with my whiz.
Now, if you start saying words like bottle instead of bottle or bottle, then I may have to roll up a sleeve, because no one should say bottle.
Same as butter. I would say butter growing up in my house.
You say butter?
I was butter.
Really?
You had to say butter. Butter. There's two T's.
Yeah, butter. It's Budder, butter.
Yeah, see, that's also incorrect.
Yeah, I know. Listen, Jason, we can go on and on.
Joshua.
But you have the rest.
Can I tell you real fast?
Oh, shit, yeah.
Real fast.
Oh, yes, go.
You say go on and on. I did a tasting the other evening where the host of it dropped me a note and said, okay, the schedule is for you to present the 5 whiskies over 45 minutes and then take a few minutes for Q&A. And
Jesus.
I read his email and laughed. I just laughed.
Yeah.
And at the point at which we hit 45 minutes, we were just about halfway through the third of 5 whiskies.
I'm surprised you got that far in 45 minutes.
Thank you. I was impressed with my own efforts, to be honest.
Wow.
I got out of that tasting after 1 hour and 40 minutes. And I purposely drew attention at multiple points to his request and my own attempts to get through 5 whiskies as quickly as I could. And I made the comment that it takes me 45 minutes to say hello. And unfortunately, I'm not blessed with that affliction in any other realms. And so I cherish it in the realm in which I do have it. But everyone in the tasting was happy. The host was over the moon. I took questions all the way through the tasting. And when I got out of it, my wife had said to me, I thought that was just going to be 45 minutes with a Q&A. And I said, oh yeah, that was never going to happen. And her comment was, here, let me give you... Christ, what was her comment? I've totally butchered this. What was her comment? Yeah. Here. This isn't going to work at all.
It's working so far.
Here.
Go on, Jimmy Fallon. Just give the punchline.
The year doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Allow me to give you double what you paid for, which now just makes me sound like one of your cheap French girls. But that's not what I was going for. I want to be one of your expensive French girls. But anyway, so yes, when you say we can go on, we can. But invariably the feedback comes back that people have enjoyed it and it has been worth their time listening to us going on and our humour, our passion, our knowledge and our expertise are often quoted back at us.
Often. I want to get us out of here on this.
Checks out.
And you and I, which means you're going to have to turn around and grab a bottle. We need to raise a glass to the good Harvey Fry.
I'm going to pick something from his favourite distillery.
What's that? A little spring. You know what? I'm going to pour the same Springbank as you. You want to tell us about this?
Nope.
All right.
Harvey's favourite distillery. And if you asked him for his favourites, he would give the same order every single time. I'm not going to give the order. But number 1 was always Springbank.
Always.
And unfortunately, over the decade that I've known him, we haven't bottled any Springbank. And Springbank pricing just becomes more and more and more astronomically bad. But I have poured a little single cask Springbank at this moment to remember Harvey by.
As of high. And this is one of my all-time favorite Springbanks. Really remarkable.
Yeah. Never got a chance to pour this for him either, so it will live as something he would have loved without actually being put through the ringer of Harvey Fry's palate. So we'll say to Harvey, and then we'll let Nick get us out of here as he looks to the future.
What do we say? What do you say? I'm terrible at these things. What would you say as a college-educated man?
I've always been taught to judge a man, a woman, a person by the number of people who show up at their funeral to pay their final regards. And Harvey will be cremated during a global pandemic.
Yeah.
There will not be anybody at his funeral. But when the pandemic allows and we all come back out from under our rocks, there will be a celebration of Harvey in Washington, D.C. And it is going to be insane. It is going to be an off-the-hook, old-school whiskey industry send-off to somebody who is loved and cherished. And I will be a part of it. You will be a part of it.
Indeed.
Many, many of our friends will be a part of it. And it will all speak to the man, the myth, the legend that was Harvey Fry. And so wherever he finds himself currently, I drink this in memory and in honour of him. Cheers, Harvey.
Cheers, Harvey.
So listen, our connection is trying to shit the bed as much as it possibly can here. And we've chatted for a fair bit here. So unfortunately, I'm going to wrap it up. But we always get out of here with the same question. And I can only imagine the things you're going to say here, because I feel like this whole interview has answered this question, but maybe you'll have some other things on top. Looking forward, looking into the crystal ball, whiskey-wise, what are you most excited about as you peer into the future?
Oh, geez, I think you'd assume that I'd know what I was going to answer, but now I'm like, what? I think it's there's two bits to it, and it's all centered around like the new producers, and I think there is something to be said of the new world producers in old world whiskey countries and the new world producers in new world whiskey countries. I'm excited to see the development of their ideas and the maturing of those ideas. You know, I've been excited about American small whiskey producers for some time, and you know, when I was at Atom, you know, we worked with some great producers. New York Distilling Company, seeing empirical rye become a thing. Fuck, that's really cool. You know, working with the crew over at Few. When I was in Norway, working with Balcones, and even in Atom, and all of those whiskies have got something to say. And I think as we get further down this journey, and new world new distillers within old world whiskey making spaces start to really see that they are making a difference in adding to that old world whiskey making story and transforming some of that stuff from the past. I think that's something I'm really excited about. And then just New World all the way. Like, it's just always incredible to hear these pioneer stories, right? Like, we don't get to hear pioneer stories from William Grant. You know, those guys are long gone. But we get to meet these people at the start of their journeys. And I think that's a really, really, really special opportunity. You know, I would have loved to have had a beer with Shinjiro Tori or Masataka Takatsuru back then, because when they were looking at their world and going, yeah, let's make whiskey. Like, what the fuck? Like, tell me, get them on the podcast. Like, let's do a seance and chat to those guys. I mean, some of the people we speak to now, that's exactly what they're doing. And
I love the way you think about that, because I think for some of us, as we cut our teeth and as we move through our whiskey journey, we only believe in the old world, to use the language that you're using there. We only believe in the old world. We only believe in the traditional. And as we see the new come online, it's too easy to be dismissive of it. Oh, it's just new. They've just arrived. I love the way you talk about it. And I would say this, and I've said this to him, to his face, Trent Tilton, who I mentioned earlier at San Diego, spend time in front of Trent, and you're talking to a mad scientist who's just like, well, I could take this and I could put it with that and I could put it into that and let it sit, and then that'll happen, and this over here. And I'm going to carry that forward after chatting with you, this idea of talking to pioneers live, right, in the moment as they're starting that journey. That's very cool. I like that.
I think, I mean, it's very influenced by kind of what we see here in New Zealand space on the wine side of things, right? You know, there's a lot of talk about across my entire lifetime about what New Zealand is as a new world wine producer. So that's really where that's influenced from. And you know, I think you're right. These pioneers, these are the moments to have those conversations. And then imagine talking about them 10 years later. You're like, whoa, hey, you were talking about this. How do you feel about that now? And just see what that conversation is like. I mean, that's what the whiskey thing is about to me. It's a journey. That's why we love it so much, because it changes and morphs and grows, and that's pulls at the heartstrings for me.
Well, you also just made me realise that Joshua and I are 10 years into this as well. And so we're a 10-year independent bottler. And we're always kind of looking, well, we're not Cadenheads, right? We're not Douglas Lang. We're not Gordon MacPhail. We don't have that multi-generational history. But we have worked our butts off for 10 years. And I can tell you the journey that we've taken in these 10 years. So, yeah, Christ, we're in this category.
Yeah, you are. You are. 100% you are. Absolutely. And you know, that's something that you only get to do once, right? Like if you carry on single cask nation, and I don't know who comes in behind you, if it's the tall strip of a lad who came in his pants the other day, if that's who you're leaving your business to, he doesn't.
Just to be clear, that was my son. Just to be clear.
Oh, brilliant.
You left the door open on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, should have closed it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, on that note, sir, I'm going to get us out of here. But thanks ever so much for your time. We wish you nothing but the best, both getting back to Scotland from New Zealand, but also with your work at Holyrood. And we continue to look forward to working on projects together. It's really cool hanging out with you.
It is, and I can't wait. I say this every time we sign off, but I can't wait till we can do it in real life and sit down with a beer. I expect that will be a much shorter conversation, because I feel that would be a pretty fun drinking session that will end spectacularly. But you know, I appreciate the chat, and I look forward to the next time we get to hang out.
Brilliant. Cheers, mate.
Thanks, mate.